Thanks to our show sponsors, the Canola School, RealAg Radio, and ADAMA Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry, ADAMA is here to deliver. Leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and shout out there to Kara Oosterhuis doing the voiceovers tonight. She's also, I think, probably writing this up as we go, so shout out to her. And, of course, producer Jay is here with me. I'm super excited for tonight's chat. Hello to Ray, and yes, a belated Happy Mother's Day to all of those out there. Peter is here, of course, so hi, Pete, and I bet, and hello to Pedro, I bet Paisley's lurking there somewhere too. So hello, Paisley. All right. Quick reminder, of course, if you collect those CEU credits, you can head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow. We'll have the episode there. You can fill out the form. Make sure you get those CEU credits. And a quick reminder, next week, I can't believe it, is the long weekend. It is the May long weekend. And so Monday, there will not be a show. And I feel like I'm going to have to send Warren Schneckenberger a direct message to tell him, because invariably on Monday afternoon, he'll be sending me a note to ask. So there you go. Tell your friends. We'll be back, of course, the week after. In fact, Kara Oosterhuis is going to be hosting that one at the end of May. Okay, tonight's topic is rotten root rots, and I am super excited to have this conversation tonight with my two guests. We'll bring them in, Clint Jurke with the Canola Council of Canada and Alison Robertson at Iowa State University. Welcome here.
Hi.
Hey, good evening.
All right. Okay, so let's start with, Clint, with the Canola Council, based out of Saskatchewan. How are things looking around where you are?
I'm in a dry pocket right here in the northwest part of the province, and as you go west, I'm sure everyone is fully aware of the extreme dry conditions that are causing all kinds of troubles out there. But, you know, like when it's dry, that means that the seeders can go. And so we are making very good progress in this area, getting the crop in the ground. So that's about the one good side of the dry conditions.
Right. You can roll and keep rolling. And we'll see if it has an impact on root rots. That's our discussion tonight. All right. And Alison, based at Iowa State University, what does the crop look like where you are?
April started off pretty warm, and we got some crop in the ground around about the middle of April, and then temperatures cooled off considerably. And we had soil temperatures sitting at below 10 Celsius for about 3 weeks. It was dry, but just cold. And so everyone was waiting for the soils to warm up. And then we got in, and the soils did start to warm up. We got in and planted a crop, and now it's been a little bit wet, but things are starting to emerge. The crop that was most recently planted is just coming up, and those crops that were planted the middle of April are also coming through as well. So they sat underground for about 3 weeks.
Okay, which is perhaps not ideal for all sorts of reasons, but especially when it comes to this stuff. So how it sat for 3 weeks, how are things looking?
So far, everybody's posting pictures on Twitter that the crop looks great. And I haven't seen anybody dig up anything yet. And that's what I want to see. I want to see what the roots look like. So, yes. So for me as a plant pathologist, I love those cold, wet conditions. But if you're a farmer, you don't like
maybe not so much. Okay, so let's dig into this a bit. Jason's here. Of course, he's based in Manitoba, so warm there, which is good. Helps dry things out, keep things rolling. Clint, of course, with the Canola Council, so let's perhaps start there. We do talk, certainly any wet conditions, we worry more about root rots, but are there bigger concerns, different concerns when it's warm and wet? Or if it's cool, things stay wetter longer? Which one's the bigger risk?
That's a good question. hot and wet versus cold and wet, which is worse?
Mm-hmm.
In general, cold and wet is where we see more diseases, particularly the damping off in very early in the season. Damping off is typically caused by Pythium species. Now, when we're talking about a lot of the seedling diseases, there's three major groups of pathogens that are involved, but typically it's the Pythium ones that are causing the majority of the damping off that we see. And so oftentimes, like, producers won't even see any canola seeds turn into plants at all. They just don't even come up above the surface. So cold, wet conditions are typically that. And so when I'm saying cold, it's usually like less than 5 degrees C.
Right.
And
Okay.
plants just don't grow very much at that temperature. So when they're stalled for a long period of time, even if we do have seeds that are treated with fungicides and that, they can time out after a while. And the wet conditions as well can wick some of that fungicide away, and we see greater problems. But, like, even when it's cold and wet, most pathogens prefer to grow when it's a little bit warmer. And so when it's warm and wet, we can see quite a bit of damage as well, although the plants, they usually have a little bit more energy that they can get out ahead of them. So that's the trade-off.
Mm-hmm. Now, Alison, you did say you said people are on Twitter anyway saying it looks great, but you want to get digging. So, but Clint mentioned, of course, that some things may not even come up. So what might be the first indication that you could be dealing with a root rot problem?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the first indications would be that maybe you don't have as many plants coming up as you seeded. And so that's your first indication that something might be going on below the surface. And then, of course, that's when you dig into your furrow, right, and have a look, see if you can find those seeds. Did they not germinate? Which is probably unlikely, right, because most of our seed has really good germination rates. But now you're looking for rotted seed, which you may or may not be able to find, depending on the conditions, probably the temperature more than anything else, and how much rotting has gone on with those bugs.
Yeah. Now, Peter asks, is there I'm going to assume he means a temperature minimum for Pythium. So I guess this is a good question. Is there sort of sort of the soils must be a certain temp before we really have to worry? And is that somewhere around that less than 5 degrees or 5 degrees? I'm going to assume that's what you mean, Peter. Maybe clarify in the comments. But
I
yeah,
could
what do
probably
you think,
jump
Clint?
in. Yeah, so the kind of the operating range for Pythium is from my understanding is, and maybe it's a little bit different the further south that you go, but in this area, 5 degrees to 15 degrees seems to be the threshold. Like, the pathogen will grow more quickly at 15 degrees, but like, the plants are also growing really quite quickly at that point. But 5 degrees seems to be the threshold. Once it gets really, really cold, then nothing really moves that much, especially once it's frozen.
All right. So or I shouldn't say one, but an aspect of what I want to talk about tonight is, of course, all the different tools we have for management of some of these diseases. But I do want to dig into a few different ones. Now, Alison, you specialize in corn and soybeans. Clint, you specialize in canola. I did pull a clip, and I will play it a bit later, about Aphanomyces, because, of course, that's a big one on the prairies that causes a major issue. I did learn, though, Alison, in digging through some of the resources, that Aphanomyces can impact alfalfa. Is that something that you've run across in your work at Iowa State?
Not so much. So, I mean, Iowa is just corn and soybean country, right? Apart from
It sure is.
probably in the northeast part of the state is where we'll have the most alfalfa. And so, yeah, I did a little bit of alfalfa when I first started at Iowa State 100 years ago. But yeah, so I can't say that I've run into Aphanomyces, no. But
Okay.
that's just because I don't, I really don't do any work on alfalfa. I usually, if there's an alfalfa question, I pass it to Lyndsey Smith at Wisconsin. So
There you go. They are kind of the experts on anything
yes.
alfalfa. As Peter says, or as he laments, I think, not even wheat in Iowa, just corn and soybeans.
No.
Clint, so just quickly though, so Aphanomyces, for the most part, it's a pea and lentil problem for the most part. Canola is clear. canola has its own problems,
Yes.
don't get me wrong, but
No.
canola is not impacted by Aphanomyces.
Thankfully, no, we've got enough
Okay.
problems.
Yeah,
No,
you really
that's
do
strictly
have
a
enough
health
problems.
problem.
Okay. Now, so one of the other questions, so I do want to talk rotation, but seed treatments are a big question here. So, and Peter's already asked, of course, do seed treatments have a longer life under cool conditions? So what can we expect, generally speaking, from our seed treatments? And does warm weather or cool weather speed that up, potentially? So, Alison, I'll start with you. When you're talking seed treatments, what do you sort of count on as far as a protective effect?
So for seed treatments, I usually count on about 3 weeks. And I would say that for corn, that's a good way to go, right? Because the way corn germinates, those cotyledons, that seed treatment stay under the soil, right? And so in cool or warm conditions, it doesn't matter how quickly that corn plant emerges, that seed treatment is down there in the soil. Now with soybean, remember that plant lifts the cotyledons above the soil, and so they have the seed treatment on them. And so I would hazard a guess, I don't actually know, that perhaps in warmer conditions where the soybean seed germinates quicker and we pull those cotyledons out with the seed treatment, that maybe that seed treatment is not going to last as long as if it's cooler and those cotyledons are sitting down in the soil. But that's just an educated guess, right?
We're good with those. And of course, it also, you have to think though as well that plant, and we talk about this a lot with canola, the faster that plant can get out of the ground and actively growing, the better off we are for all sorts of things. So, Clint, when we're talking canola, how long can we sort of count on our seed treatments? Is there a difference between treatments that we should be worried about?
I'm not aware of any difference for the fungicide components. That it is around 3 weeks is what is recommended by the manufacturers. To really get into more detail, I'd need to phone a friend. How many calls am I allowed during this program?
Yeah, you're allowed 3. You're actually allowed
3?
3. Yeah.
Okay.
So so you just let producer Jay know, he'll dial them in. And then there we go. So so the 3-week window though is what we're sort of hoping for. Now, to jump problems just quickly, because of course we always have to mention flea beetles, Clint. Insecticide, I know it's not tonight's topic, but insecticides, how long do we expect those to stay active for a flea beetle pressure?
It's similar. It's at 3 to 4 week windows is what we get protection for. There is a dose response as well. Back in the day when some of the first insecticides came out, the window of opportunity or the window of control was less, and then as they added more, say thiamethoxam, and that we got longer window of control for flea beetles, and so that's the window in which we're still talking at this time.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, Alison, you sent a slide, and so I want to stick with this, the idea with the cool seeding conditions, cool planting conditions, how much more of a risk we may be at. So, Jay, I think that's the second slide that Alison sent. Maybe. We might have a bit of a rolling through things here. No, it's a slide. So it's like a chart. There are 2 charts. It's the second one. He'll find it. We'll just give him a minute. Producer Jay does a great job there. Okay, so there's this one and one more. Which one do you want to start with, Alison?
I don't mind. I mean, we were talking about when is Pythium active, and Clint was mentioning 5 to 15 degrees, and I have to keep remembering that we're now talking in Celsius.
Yes, thank you.
So I grew up with Celsius, right? And then I had to switch to Fahrenheit. And so, and I agree with that. And this is some research from a PhD student who was in my lab. But what it shows you is that some Pythium prefer cooler conditions and some prefer warmer conditions, and some really don't care about the temperature. So if you look at that, we tested at 13, 18, and 23. So that's across the top, ABC, and then down the right-hand side, we have the species that we looked at. So these are species that we commonly find in association with corn and soybean in Iowa. And so the Luterium, you can see, temperature doesn't matter. But then with something like Oropapillum and particularly Torulosum, they like the cold conditions, but they don't like the warm conditions. Whereas Sylvaticum Sylvaticum's more like me and prefers it nice and warm, right? And so when we have these different temperature conditions, then we're getting Pythium in, as Clint mentioned, but it may be one species over another species.
I am more of a, what'd you say, Torulosum? I like
Yes.
it cool. Very
Oh,
moderate. Yeah.
no.
It can only be over 25°C if I'm at the beach. Other than that, come on. Okay. So, all right. Now, this is interesting. Yes, Clint, down in front.
I have a question since we're just on the subject of Pythium. Do you see Ultimum all that much in Iowa
Yes.
area?
Yes, we
Yeah.
do see Ultimum, and this was part of a big project that was done across several states, Clint. And so there was already someone working in Ultimum, and so my lab said, okay, we want to work on these 4 species, and so that's why we worked on those 4 species. Yeah, so we didn't want to be reinventing the wheel.
Right. So, but it's a good question about, we often think about root rots as a sort of collection, right? We often don't differentiate between some of them because they're just so similar, and you can't necessarily always tell what's what, and it sort of doesn't matter. It does, but it doesn't. So I guess that's right. It's sort of a, we've got Pythium, and so I guess my question is, for something like Pythium, is it really important to know which one, or just to know that you have a Pythium problem? Clint, which one would you narrow down into?
Yeah, I'm of the persuasion that more information is always better, because I think with better data you can make better decisions. But when it comes really down to the management in the field for growers, even knowing that you have a Pythium problem versus a Fusarium or a Rhizoctonia problem, it's probably not that important. You just know that you have something that's chewing up your roots and hypocotyls. But from an academic point of view, and our understanding of the biology of the pests and that, it is important to know what species you're dealing with, or even subspecies, or even down to strain levels, because that does have an impact. Because if these do start traveling, then there might actually be different controls that are necessary, and which we do see that with other diseases that we deal with in canola, like clubroot and blackleg, where we are talking about races and pathotypes and that. But for the root rots, like you got a rotten seedling. It's even hard to tell between genuses or even kingdoms, like knowing that it's a fungus that killed this versus an oomycete, which is a kind of like a fungus. Yeah.
Right. So and so that question, so Peter wants to know, looking at just that Pythium list. So further to your point, Clint. So Alison, is there a difference in how pathogenic any of those lines are? So would they all equally infect a plant based on temperature, or do we know that much?
So along the bottom of that slide on the x-axis, those were the different hosts, right? Corn and soybean. And then the height of those bars gives you the pathogenicity of those species. So so that's how you can, at 13 degrees, you can see that we had 100% root rot, almost 100% root rot severity with the Torulosum. So Torulosum is much more aggressive or pathogenic at 13 degrees C, but then look at Sylvaticum, right? We're sitting around about 20% root rot. So when it's warmer, now we have hardly any root rot caused by Torulosum, but with Sylvaticum, we're up to almost 100%. So, so the height of the bars kind of gives you an idea of the pathogenicity or the aggressiveness. So, and then you can see Luterium is kind of hovering around there in the middle, right? It's at cool temperatures, it's not as pathogenic as Torulosum. At warm temperatures, it's not as pathogenic as Sylvaticum.
Right.
So
But it
I think
certainly
that's
seems to be sort of, equally pathogenic across all temperatures, though,
yes.
or relatively so. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
Remember, this
yeah.
is done in the growth chamber, right? So
Right.
they're inoculated plants in cups, and so there might be nuances out in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to, Jay, if you could queue up. So speaking of races and all those sorts of fun things, we've got a clip that we're going to run on Phytophthora root rot in beans. And so we'll run to that clip. This is a soybean school. And then we'll hear from one of our sponsors for tonight before we jump into managing on a race basis, if it's possible.
Yeah, so the Manitoba Pulse Growers released a paper a couple years ago. They had done a lot of work and to identify what races we have, the predominant races here in Manitoba. And those findings said that race 3, 4, 25, and 28 were the dominant races, with 4, at least at that time, was the most prevalent within our soils. So that's really important to know, because you can look back and see what, if you have a gene in your soybean variety, how that's going to act on those races. So if we look at the RPS1A gene, it actually doesn't get any of those races. So that's important to know. Even if you have a gene, it may not be acting on the ones, the major races that you have. And then it falls back on your field tolerance. So it's just a general tolerance of the soybean plant to the races, of Phytophthora that you have in your field. And that can be really good. I mean, having really good field tolerance is awesome. The gene just helps it out. So genes like 1C, 3A, 1K, all of those have more effectiveness on the races that we have here. And if you get into even get into gene stacks like we see in blackleg or clubroot, that's sort of the next generation where you're going to get multiple modes, if you will, of resistance working on those, and combine that with good field tolerance, and you're going to have a really good Phytophthora product to withstand anything, almost anything that you see in your field.
I guess there are 3 main real ways to prevent Phytophthora or manage it. And is this a fair way of describing it? We have field selection, and that would have to do with our soil type, whether it's heavy or a lighter ground, whether we have that water ponding issue or pooling on the surface. We have crop rotation, and then also the genetic resistance within the plant. Is that fair to kind of sum it up as those 3 being factors in it, along with, of course, weather and things that are out of our control?
Yeah, absolutely. Soil type is a major factor, and without excess rain, you're really not going to see Phytophthora at all. So on a dry year, Phytophthora is not an issue. But years like this, where we've had some really huge rains because of all the thunderstorms, Phytophthora is going to show up a lot more, and you're really going to actually test your variety and find out just how strong its Phytophthora package actually is.
Our sponsors tonight are ADAMA Canada, RealAg Radio, and the Canola School. From pre-seeding seeder setup and checks, to pest insect identification and advice on nutrient management decisions, to tips on determining swath timing, Real Agriculture's Canola School is a video series that tackles every facet of the canola growing season in an engaging and informative format. The Canola School is made possible by support from BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola. Learn more at canolaschool.com.
Oh man, now we get to talk about race types, but also I forgot about soil types and if that makes a difference. On this show, we talk about soil a lot. And there's a reason for that, because it matters a lot. So I'm thinking root rots, they love moisture, whether it's cold or warm. So obviously better drainage, better, because we're going to have less water sitting around. But not all soil types are created equal. So even if they are well drained for their soil type, they're not going to necessarily be super well drained. So Clint, I'll start with you. Are you making a call based on soil type as far as risk level when trying to manage for root rots?
We don't really make that recommendation per se. like the clip said, the drier the soil, the less the risk for the disease. And so certainly the finer textured soils do hold more moisture, and if there has been a significant rain events, then that water holding capacity is going to be certainly a lot greater. But unless a producer is growing crops on essentially sand, like there is always going to be a risk of losses to root pathogens and that. And so there's certainly other factors that increase the risk.
Mhm.
But yeah, soil texture, soil types do have an impact for sure.
Alison, do you see big differences in infection rates between soil types?
I mean, I would say, when we do our trials, we'll go for heavier soils that tend to hold on to that water a little bit more because we want disease. And then obviously there's a lot of tiling that goes in Iowa, right, just to drain those fields because they are so wet. So, yeah, I mean, just fungi and oomycetes, they like moisture. And so anything you can do to get rid of that moisture is going to help reduce that risk.
Mm-hmm. Good internal drainage isn't just tile drainage, everyone. Okay, so but let's talk, race specific or pathogen type specific management. So we certainly have with some of the pests that we deal with, it is going to matter based on the genetic resistance we may be able to choose. So Clint, where are we at as far as root rots go on canola? Do we have decent genetic resistance in a lot of our lines that we rely on?
Actually, the species of canola that we grow now mainly, which is Brassica napus, or called Argentine canola, it is actually fairly resistant to a lot of the root pathogens in comparison to some of the cousin species that we used to grow more so, like Brassica rapa, Polish canola, or Brassica gensea canola. They have increased levels of susceptibility to almost all of the root pathogens, so Pythium, Fusarium, and Rhizoctonia. So the good news is that 99% of the canola acres are now that Napus type. So that's giving us a really nice boost. But beyond that, there are breeding programs that are looking at improving our level of resistance, particularly to Rhizoctonia, because of the three classes of pathogens, that's the most aggressive one in canola, and it's the one that it was the one that was causing the most problems for Polish canola in the past. So there are breeding programs that are looking at dialing that up, improving it so that we don't have to rely as strongly on the fungicide seed treatments that we are. But race-specific breeding in root rots, if you don't include club roots in that, then no, I'm not aware of anything that's happening at that level.
We're not talking about club root yet. We will.
Not yet.
At some point. We have to. I'm sorry, but we do. So now, Alison, so how much does sort of race-specific or genetic resistance to certain types of pathogens play in the research that you do? How do you sort of account for, what a variety maybe or a hybrid has as far as genetic resistance?
So I also work on Phytophthora on soybean. So we do a lot of screening, looking for new resistance genes. Just recently, we did a big survey across the Midwest, and I mean, most of the commercial varieties here in the US have the 1A, 1C, 1K genes. I mean, 3A, 1C, and 1K genes. And what we're finding is that a lot of the Phytophthora population across the soybean region are able to overcome those genes. And so those genes are no longer effective. And really, we need to be putting some new genes into the germplasm. But the other thing is, as well as that, we know that we can have a lot of different races in the field. And so really, we rely more on that field tolerance to Phytophthora. In terms of the other root rot pathogens, the Pythium and the Fusarium, I am involved with a big project that's being led out of Ohio State, first by Ann Dorrance. She's about to retire now. But we are finding resistance to Pythium and Fusarium. That project is funded by the United Soybean Board. And so the breeders who are on that project are starting to come up with lines that can be used for breeding. Of course, that's not race resistance, right? Because we don't have races with Pythium and Fusarium. That's just general background tolerance, field resistance kind of thing. But yeah.
So for any of these, of the major ones, and we can go through a few of them, I mean, they're condition specific, obviously,
Yes.
but they can have host specific. Some of these, of course, get shared. So
Yes.
what role, and Alison will pretend that there is rotation in Iowa, but what role can rotation play in trying to manage some of these? Are there some that, actually benefit from rotation, or are they just so endemic and there just aren't enough crops in the mix?
Yeah, I mean, so Phytophthora soji is host specific, right? So you would think rotation would help with that, but then Phytophthora soji produces those oospores that survive in the soil for lots and lots of years, right? So rotation doesn't help there. And then Pythium and Fusarium, I mean, they have such a wide host range. They can infect alfalfa, canola, wheat, corn, soybean, you know. So, I think when it comes to these root rots, rotation is, in my opinion, right, is not really going to help a whole lot.
Unlike other things, which it does. So Clint, I'll go to you. When we can talk about other things too, but for root rots, same idea. I mean, if we're dealing with something like Pythium, we have too many hosts.
Yeah, a longer rotation in general is a good practice, just in terms of reducing some level of risk, but it doesn't solve all of our problems, unfortunately. Like it reduces risk, but there's a big risk profile, and so it might knock it down like one or two steps in that larger spectrum. If a producer is growing canola after canola after canola after canola in a just year after year for a multiple, you will end up just increasing the level of that pathogen that is becoming more and more adapted to specializing on canola in particular. So breaking that up as much as you can is a good idea, but it's exactly as Alison said. Like there's the fusariums and the pythiums. They're happy feeding on pulses and on cereals, and on many weed species that we have in our fields as well. So the spore load is really not going to diminish that much, unfortunately. And it's going to be the other environmental conditions that are going to have a bigger impact.
Right, that are going to dictate these things. So in having said that, and Peter, you're forgiven for shouting at us that rotation certainly helps reduce root rots in edible beans. Edible beans are special though, Pete. So so dry beans, edible beans, they're special. Now, I'd love to know which particular ones, Peter, you're referring to, if there's one in general. But Jason, I sort of read your mind there, so mind melds. But so further to this point, if we're alternating between corn and soybeans, screening genetic resistance is important, but rotation's not going to do anything. So what other practices are part of the mix to try and get ahead of some of the root rots?
Me.
Yes. Can you solve this problem for everyone who's waiting?
I mean, seed treatments will help. I mean, really, just I think the key is, can we get that crop out of the ground as quickly as possible, because that's going to reduce your risk. And so when you plant and the seed and the soil temperatures stay below 10 for the next 3 weeks, right? below 10, those soybeans and those corn seeds are just sitting there, just leaking all these nutrients. And all those seedling pathogens think it's Thanksgiving, or I don't know, I can't think of a special Canadian holiday. But I
We
mean,
also have Thanksgiving. It's
oh, you
just
do? Do you?
earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just in
So,
October.
I
It's
mean,
fine.
yeah, those seedling pathogens, those root rot pathogens are just like yum, 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 right? And they're just, and so I think that if we can get that crop out of the ground quicker, then we reduce risk a whole lot. And so maybe like timing planting, keeping an eye on the weather when those soil temperatures are increasing, and then just getting in there. And you know, if we can just have good soil temperatures for a week, if they drop back down again, you know, for a few days, that's okay, because that crop's ahead now. It's at a safe stage. If it gets infected, it'll just be a nibble. It's not gonna devastate that crop. I don't know. What do you think, Clint?
He specializes in
I
canola.
agree.
We don't do the greatest job at getting canola up and out of the ground. We've made
Well,
some
it's so
inroads,
cold
but
up
it's
there.
tough. Well, and it's a teeny seed.
Yeah, a
And,
teeny,
and
teeny,
that
tiny seed.
that is the secret.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Like you need to get that crop out of the ground as quickly as possible, because those seeds, canola seeds, they just don't have a lot of energy, and if they have to come through 2 inches of soil, they'll expend a lot of that energy, and they need to start photosynthesizing as quickly as possible, and then it can build its defenses against soil-borne pathogens. So getting those cotyledons to sunlight as quickly as possible is key. But as well, like the other agronomic factors that are important are just ensuring that the crop is going to be healthy through that early part of its life cycle. Is there going to be mechanical damage, like feeding from insect pests, that can reduce the risk? It can just stunt the crop. It can hurt the crop, and now it has less reserves in which it can fight off any diseases. We see that later on in the season, where insects like root maggots, they tunnel into canola roots, and then that becomes a wound for rhizoctonia and other root pathogens. So the best that we can do at fighting off all of those other troubles, and fertility as well. Like if the crop is deficient in any aspect of its growth, then that's going to have an impact, as well as their energy and their capability of fighting off root pathogens. So doing just good agronomy all the way through is key to staying ahead of the root pathogens, unfortunately.
Now, there was a question earlier, and I'll ask it now. So whenever we think of, any selection pressure, we do think about resistance. Is there evidence of fungicide resistance with our seed treatments at this stage? Are we worried about that yet, or not?
Oh boy, I hope you can answer this, Alison. I'm struggling to remember if there were. I know that there have been some fungicide seed treatment changes over the years, and whether or not that's a response to declining efficacy against some of those pathogens. But yeah, I'm hoping you can help out here.
So we did some fungicide screening, and also Marty Chilvers at the University of Michigan did some fungicide screening. And so we do find that between the species, they can vary in their sensitivity. Oh, and there was also some work done at Ohio State. So, I mean, every now and then we can detect, you might get an isolate, recover something from a soybean that may be a little bit more resistant or less sensitive to a fungicide. But, it's not like those when we develop fungicides to those foliar applied, when we develop resistance to those foliar applied fungicides. The cat just jumped up on the table, and I'm thinking about the pandemic, and you always have to have a cat. Right?
Yes, you do, actually. We love to meet them. It has happened many times. Don't worry, it'll happen again. Yeah, it's fine.
You need to come say hi,
Yeah,
Casper.
see, there you go.
Okay,
Hello,
out the
Casper.
way,
Yeah,
bud.
there you go. Out of the way. We've
yeah.
had children on the show. We've had dogs, cats. It's fine. Yeah.
I was going to say, though, that Marty Chilvers' lab did find that there was a particular group of Pythium that were insensitive to ethoboxam, the seed treatment there. So, and that was not, they had not developed a resistance. They were just completely insensitive to it. And they did identify a gene or something along with that. But so, yeah, I mean, so yes, you can find resistance sometimes, but it's not a big issue. And I can't imagine it being a big issue just because seed treatment just treats such a small part of the soil, right? And exposes those organisms in that very small area. And yeah, so
Right.
I hope I answered the question.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it feels like we at
The
least don't have.
Ohio State, Ray.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yes, the Ohio State. And yes, Real Agriculture supports cats. That would be Kara behind that one. She is a big cat lover. Tubby should make an appearance on this. Okay, we are quickly going to go to our last sponsor read of the night. And then we've got a great graphic about root rots wrecking furniture that we're going to go to after that. Jay, if you could.
Our sponsors tonight are ADAMA Canada, the Canola School, and RealAg Radio. RealAg Radio is Canada's only daily 1-hour agricultural radio show broadcast across North America on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. Hosted by Sean Haney with a diverse cast of guests, the show airs weekdays at 4:30 p.m. Eastern across Canada and the U.S. and is also available on realagriculture.com, the RealAg podcast stream, and our YouTube channel. Visit realagradio.com for more.
Okay, yes, Ray DeBanco. If you interact with nutrient folks at ISU, say hello to Antonio. Yes, okay, there you go. Ray knows everyone. Okay, thank you, Alison. This is what we do on the show. We just bring everybody together. And everybody says hello. Okay, so Clint, you did send from the Canola Council a fantastic graphic that I just feel we have to talk about because, and I don't know who on your team did this, but hats off to them because it is a fantastic description of trying to figure out how aggressive things are. And so while it is maybe too small to read, anyone who wants this, Clint, I'm sure that they can find it on the Canola Council website, or I can send it to you if you would like. But you'll note, though you can't see it, or maybe you can, the Fusarium subspecies may break through doors and windows and may destroy furniture. So this is what I was referring to. Okay, so Clint, take it away if you would. What is this telling us? Because it's brilliant. I love it.
Yeah, this came out of some brainstorming that our team had at the Canola Council, but largely the analogy at the top came from Krista Anderson, who works for Bayer as a seed treatment specialist. She would be actually really great for you to have on this. We should have. That's who I would phone as a friend.
I'll add the list. Yeah, and that's your phone a friend. Okay, I'll add her to the list.
That's my phone a friend. Yeah, so this analogy really came from her, and it resonated really well. That just to understand the different approaches that these three pathogen classes take in infecting roots, particularly canola, but I suspect that it would apply to other crops as well. Like so Pythium being what causes the dampening off phenomenon mostly, but not exclusively. The other pathogens can cause that as well. But it's really quite a specialist when it comes to the infection process. Like it starts out its life cycle as little zoospores swimming in the soil, and so it's usually kind of the first one on the scene when it's for a germinating seed, and it's looking for root tips because it doesn't have the energy or the functionality to invade roots where there's a cuticle already formed. And so it's only at the root tips where the cuticle hasn't been formed that it has the resources to penetrate root cells and then start the infection process. But because it's the first on the scene, it usually winds its way in. But fusariums, though, they're a true fungi, and so they infect as hyphae, like the mycelium, the long stringy fungal bits that are typically imagined when you think about fungi. They have a mechanism in which they can actually like bust into the cells much more easily. They can go through cuticles and that. But rhizoctonia is even more aggressive in that it's not just a single point that it'll break into a root. Rhizoctonia, the mycelium will grow alongside the root hairs, and all along the length of it, it's smashing its way in and causing. And that's often why we see like wire stem form, usually from rhizoctonia with new seedlings, where the whole hypocotyl below the cotyledons before the seed leaves, or underneath the seed leaves, that whole stem just turns into this little brown wire, and that's usually just because of rhizoctonia just so aggressively growing through that whole hypocotyl. So we like this analogy just because it helps us conceptualize the difference in how these pathogens interact with plant hosts, and it gives us an understanding as well, like the Fusarium genus has a number of different species that are involved in infecting canola roots. And each species is kind of adapted to different soil temperatures and different soil moistures and different environmental conditions. So this is why we don't really say that, while it's only cold, wet soils is your only risk. Well, no, actually, there's going to be some species that are more adapted to warm, wet soils that are going to be causing problems as well. So that. Hopefully, this gives folks the understanding of the spectrum of diseases. But yeah, certainly, if you really want to geek out on soil pathogens, this is on Canola Encyclopedia under the root rot section. You can download it yourself.
Right. Yeah, we do. This is a group of people that does that, Clint. So you're in good company. Pete wants to know where Phytophthora and Aphanomyces fit. So I don't know about Aphanomyces, Pete, if we can get that answer. But Alison, where would you put, as far as the aggressiveness and sort of the damage done? Where does Phytophthora? I can't even say it right now.
I'd probably put it with the Fusarium.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, it'll, especially once it's infected, then, and it gets into that taproot and into the stem, it'll destroy, you'll get that brown lesion coming up and a lot of root rot, right? Those plants are easy to pull out of the ground because all the root rot's gone. Whereas, like Clint says, with the Pythium, it's just there on the root tips. And as soon as those roots are developed, Pythium just can't get an edge in. So maybe Fusarium. I don't think it's as harsh as rhizoctonia.
Yeah. Oh, so there you go. Look at these. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, producer Jay. Yeah, we love visuals. So there you go. Now, okay, so to bring this back though to that question of knowing what we're dealing with, there are of course some visuals that we can determine sort of what it is we're dealing with, and that is important information. So this is, I mean, it depends on the time of year. I know if we relate to, say, Aphanomyces or something like clubroot, which, a different disease, but we often see very late in the season, we find dead patches or we find, premature ripening or those sorts of things, and we dig down and maybe find evidence and maybe don't. So, is this something that we should have as agronomists, as farmers, on our radar all season long to try and be looking at what we might be dealing with on the roots? Clint, I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's knowing what is taking away yield in your field is essential for your success as a producer, and for anybody that's an agronomist as well. Like being able to identify and with confidence being able to say to a producer that this is what is causing yield loss, and these are the steps that we can do next time that you want to grow this crop or another crop in this field. So knowing what is the so-called yield robber is essential. Now, for most canola producers, knowing whether it's a Pythium or it's a Fusarium that caused those seedlings to die off is probably not that important. Likely it has to do with the soil conditions and that you've just have run out of time on your seed treatment, and the plants just didn't have the energy in which to fight off these diseases. But for later season infections, there is a disease complex, and I think there's a picture here a little bit later on called brown girdling root rot, if we can skip ahead to that. This is a really interesting phenomenon in that it's not just one pathogen that causes these symptoms. It's a combination of them. Now, the pathologists that work on this disease believe that rhizoctonia is the major causal agent, but Fusarium and Pythium hitch a ride, and they all interact and work in a synergistic fashion and make things much worse. So if producers are observing this type of condition in the field, then you know that, well, you really got a problem, and you should look at what were the conditions that led up to the development of brown girdling root rot, because this will rob yield. This will take away yield, regardless if you're growing Argentine or Polish canola. Like this will take yield away for sure. So knowing what are the conditions, was it seeded into cold, wet soils? Did soil test reveal that we're deficient in potash or phosphorus? Like, look very closely as to what are some of the conditions that could have led to unhealthy plants that have developed this, so that next time you can avoid this as much as possible.
Alison probably thinks this is cool. I think it looks ugly. So sorry.
Yeah.
But Alison's a pathologist. She thinks it's cool. I think it's gross. Great question, Jason, out of Manitoba. Alison, are you looking at whether incorporating cover crops would help hinder root rots in tight rotations? And if so, any observations so far? I almost think it could almost be the opposite, because what if it's another host?
So you're right on the money, Lyndsey. So actually, I've been working with cover crops and looking at root rots on corn and soybean for almost 10 years now. And you're absolutely right. So the main cover crop that we use here in Iowa is cereal rye, because it survives our winters. And so I've mainly concentrated on that. And really, we've been trying to understand why, when you plant corn following cereal rye, you get a decrease in yield. Not every year and not every field, but it does happen. And so, so we were able to show that cereal rye hosts the Pythium and the Fusarium that causes seedling disease on corn and soybeans. And when you plant corn following cereal rye, you get seedling disease, you get root rot. It's only caused by Pythium. And so not by the Fusarium, even though the Fusarium is there, it's the Pythium that's causing the problem. And interestingly, on soybeans, if you grow soybeans following cereal rye, you get absolutely no root rot. So I like to say that soybean is I know, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't.
Soybean is very resilient to cover crops, and it'll grow fine following that. And when I'm talking about cover crops, I'm talking about cereal rye now, right? Yeah. But corn is a princess. I actually picked up that quote from a Canadian farmer who said, corn is a princess. Yep. And it does not like to follow. One of the reasons why it doesn't like to follow cereal rye, apart from the allelopathy, nitrogen immobilization, etc. And Clint kind of hit on this with, we want to keep, agronomics is so important to keep that crop as healthy as possible so that it can defend itself. So corn, the princess, following the cereal rye, with everything going on,
we call corn a princess on the show quite often, so you're right on the money. So there you go. Although Clint, I'm sorry, but also canola is known to be quite high maintenance on this show. So just
the Cinderella crop, right?
It is the Cinderella crop. It is. All right. No root rot, Peter. So there you go. None on following cereal rye. So let's look into that, Pete. Add it to your list. Okay, so Clint, I did promise, and we are short on time here, but I did want to talk very briefly about later season diseases that actually are early season diseases, and that being verticillium stripe and blackleg. So of course, we see the impacts of these, and we see the yield robbing of these late in the season. We identify them later in the season, but when does infection happen for, let's start maybe with blackleg and then verticillium stripe?
Sure. Yeah. So blackleg it's not a root crop. Like it starts with airborne spores and it infects the foliar part, but the pathogen grows down to the top of the root and even penetrates about the top inch of the root. And so we often see evidence of the pathogen there. It's so, but you're right. Like for it to get to that part of the top of the root, infection happens usually immediately in the season at cotyledon stage, 1 leaf, 2 leaf. Later than that, the plant usually just physically outgrows the speed of the pathogen to get down to that part of the plant. Well, verticillium longisporum is the pathogen that causes verticillium stripe. It invades the roots just like fusarium does. It's quite similar in a lot of respects to fusarium diseases, but it grows through the vascular tissue up into the stem. And so it's one of the few root pathogens. The other one that does this is Fusarium oxysporum, which caused fusarium wilt, which used to be a problem for us 20 years ago. Verticillium, once it gets up into the stem, then it starts producing microsclerotia that gets spread around and becomes a bigger problem. So it is a true root disease that it infects through the root. And so if we had some good defenses that would inhibit that infection at the beginning, which we don't at this point in time, that would be a really good way of preventing that particular disease from becoming a problem. But here we are.
Here we are.
Disease,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, new. So, and that is, so when you say, like, that's genetic screening that I believe is happening, is it not, to see what's already in the genetics we're using as far as verticillium is concerned? Yeah.
Yeah, there is some promising work that's happening there. It looks like there is some partial resistance, and so seed companies are working very hard to incorporate that in. So fingers crossed that might be our solution for this.
So I'll throw it out there because somebody's probably going to ask, or when they watch this after, they're going to send me the question: is a fungicide pass that early in the season going to protect against blackleg or verticillium?
Sorry, I just got distracted by the comments on verticillium.
Sorry. on princesses and queens and you name it. So if we're talking blackleg infection at cotyledon, 2-leaf, whatever, and verticillium entering very early, is a fungicide pass that early warranted potentially?
For blackleg, yes. A foliar fungicide will control blackleg at that point, but it needs to be early. It needs to be in the first pass with the herbicide application. Later than that, it's too late. The pathogen will get ahead of you at that point. But for verticillium, there is no fungicide that works on it, unfortunately.
Really?
Yeah.
See, Alison, aren't you glad you just have to worry about corn and soybeans? Like, no big whoop.
They keep me busy enough. I don't need another crop.
Yeah. Well, Pete would like more wheat everywhere. 3 crops, I'm telling you. Does wonders here in Ontario.
Yeah.
All right. We are out of time. This has been absolutely fantastic. So much fun. I appreciate both of you joining us here tonight. Thank you to everyone who joined us in the comments for the fantastic questions. We will at some point determine which crop is what as far as royalty. And we'll put out a definitive guide at some point. Of course, thank you to our show sponsors, to RealAg Radio, to the Canola School, and ADAMA Canada. A reminder, and Warren, I did see you pop on there. We will not have a show next week. We're going to have a day off, but we'll be back the Monday after that, 8 p.m. Eastern. Clint, thank you so much.
That was fun. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Alison, for being willing, and thank you to Casper for the guest appearance. Yes.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, there you go. And thank you, producer Jay, and to Kara, who's writing this up. And if you head on over to realagriculture.com, you can find a replay and all past episodes of the Agronomists. Cheers, everybody.